If a company wants to increase its profits, the instinct is almost universally to just sell more, boost sales, push marketing, capture more market share.
Yeah, that is definitely the default setting for almost every business.
Right. But the data we're looking at today in our supply chain management sources shows something, well, completely counterintuitive.
It really flips the whole script.
It does. A 10% reduction in your direct materials cost is often significantly more profitable than a 10% increase in sales. Welcome to today's deep dive, where we are unpacking the hidden, the nuts and bolts of corporate purchasing.
And we're really looking closely at how these massive organizations buy at scale, manage inventory, and enforce these huge global standards.
Exactly. And to kick this off, let's just run the math on the scenario provided in the sources, because I feel like it illustrates this perfectly for you listening. So imagine you are selling a product for $10.
Okay.
$10. And $5 of those dollars go directly to materials like the raw components required to actually build the thing.
Right.
Now, if your procurement team negotiates that materials cost down by just 10%, so saving 50 cents, bringing the cost down to $4.50, your gross profit margin leaps from 10% all the way up to 15%.
Which is crazy when you think about it. I mean, that's a 50% proportional increase in your gross profit.
Yeah.
And it's derived entirely from back-end efficiency.
Yes. But on the flip side, if you take the traditional route and just boost your overall sales volume by 10% without changing those underlying costs, your profit margin only crawls up to 13%.
Yeah, the math doesn't lie. You genuinely make more money by, engineering a smarter purchasing apparatus than by simply selling harder.
Right. And capturing those savings, it requires dismantling the daily physical mechanics of how materials are acquired. We have to, look at the traditional purchasing cycle.
Yeah, the traditional cycle, which, it's a highly structured, formal process, but it's designed primarily for control and auditability, right? Not speed.
So it's slow.
Extremely slow. It generally follows this rigid 5-step sequence. First, you've got generating a requisition, which is just internal signaling that a department needs a material.
Basically someone saying, hey, we're out of screws.
Exactly. Then second, issuing the formal purchase order, which is the actual legal contract sent to the supplier.
Right, the PO.
Then third is the follow-up phase to secure delivery dates. Fourth is actually receiving and verifying the physical goods at the dock. And finally, fifth, matching the invoice to the PO to approve payment.
Okay, but looking at that structure through the lens of a massive global enterprise, that 5-step cycle is essentially a gauntlet of administrative friction.
Oh, absolutely.
It makes perfect sense if you were buying a $2 million piece of specialized factory equipment. You want multiple layers of sign-off for that.
Sure, you need the control.
But running that entire 5-step sequence for every single routine batch of raw aluminum or basic hardware, it introduces severe bottlenecks.
It completely gums up the works.
Right. The administrative overhead just to process all that paperwork would entirely eat up that 50-cent margin improvement we were just talking about.
Yeah, and that administrative latency is the absolute enemy of modern supply chain efficiency. So when the sources discuss lean purchasing, their primary objective is stripping out that exact transactional friction for routine stuff.
Just getting the paperwork out of the way.
Exactly. And this is where organizations pivot to what's called contract buying and utilize things like blanket purchase orders.
Okay, so this sounds kind of like the corporate equivalent of an auto pay system or a subscription box.
That is actually a perfect analogy.
You establish the parameters once so you don't have to repeatedly litigate the details every single Tuesday.
He captures the mechanism perfectly, yeah. Instead of generating a unique requisition and negotiating terms and issuing a completely new PO every single time the factory floor runs low, the procurement team negotiates one master contract, the blanket order.
And that covers everything.
Right. This single agreement establishes the pricing matrix, the quality tolerances, delivery terms, everything, for an extended period, usually an entire fiscal year.
So when the factory actually needs the raw aluminum, they just bypass the procurement department entirely.
Yep. The local operations manager simply issues a release against that existing blanket order.
Wow. So they just trigger a delivery based on those pre-approved terms?
Precisely. And by consolidating what would have been, hundreds of individual transactions into one master commitment, the buyer is giving the supplier this predictable, high-volume demand.
Which is exactly what suppliers want.
Exactly. And in exchange, the buyer secures that aggressive bulk pricing they need to drive down the direct materials cost while simultaneously eliminating all that administrative labor.
Okay, so we have automated the ordering mechanism. The blanket POs are running quietly in the background, removing friction. But I mean, systematically decentralizing this process creates a very real operational vulnerability, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Because if we are no longer running every single purchase through a centralized desk, who's actually monitoring the physical warehouse shelves?
Right. Someone still has to know when you're out of stuff.
Because managing the exact timing of those releases is critical. If you trigger a delivery too early, you inflate your holding costs. But if you trigger it too late, you stop the entire assembly line.
Yeah, the classic inventory tightrope. And this specific vulnerability is what led to one of the most significant structural shifts in supply chain management, which is managed inventories.
Okay, let's get into this.
Specifically, we're talking about vendor-managed inventory, or VMI, and its counterpart, consignment inventory. So instead of the buyer trying to perfectly time their releases against the blanket order, they just shift the burden of inventory management directly onto the supplier.
See, I need to push back on this on behalf of the listener, because let's really analyze the incentive structure here.
Right.
From the outside, VMI just looks like the buyer is taking their operational headaches and tossing them over the fence. If I am the supplier, why on earth would I voluntarily take on the labor of monitoring my client's warehouse shelves?
It does seem like a bad deal at first glance.
Right, because that requires resources, labor, and it assumes a massive amount of logistical responsibility that I shouldn't have to deal with.
I know, it seems completely asymmetrical. Until, that is, you examine the primary operational risk for any manufacturer, which is demand volatility.
And predictability.
Exactly. A supplier's absolute worst-case scenario is what we call the bullwhip effect. It's that sudden, unanticipated rush order from a buyer who just panicked because they realized they were out of stock.
Right.
When that happens, the supplier is forced to halt their current production runs, pay overtime labor, expedite shipping, and potentially even strain relationships with their other clients just to accommodate this one emergency.
The rush order basically introduces pure chaos into their production schedule.
Chaos. Pure chaos. Vendor-managed inventory eliminates that chaos.
How so?
By taking responsibility for the buyer's inventory levels, the supplier gains direct, unimpeded visibility into the buyer's actual consumption rates.
Oh, I see.
They are no longer waiting around for a frantic phone call, right? They can literally see the exact rate at which those aluminum components are being used up on the assembly line.
Which means we need to look at the mechanics of how this is actually achieved. Because obviously this isn't a supplier sending some guy with a clipboard to count pallets in the buyer's warehouse.
No, definitely not.
This requires deep digital integration. The sources emphasize continual coordination, which, I mean, that implies a pretty robust technological bridge between the two companies.
Yeah, it relies heavily on electronic data interchange, or EDI, and deeply integrated enterprise resource planning systems. Basically, as the buyer's factory consumes a component, their internal system logs it. That data is instantly transmitted over to the supplier's ERP system. The supplier sets automated exception alerts. So when the buyer's inventory drops below a dynamically calculated threshold, the supplier's system automatically schedules a replenishment run.
Wow. So the servers are essentially just talking to each other to regulate the flow of physical goods.
Exactly.
The supplier trains the administrative labor of, managing the inventory in exchange for total operational stability.
Right, because now they can optimize their own manufacturing runs and consolidate their freight shipping because they completely control the timing of the replenishment.
And for the buyer, they dramatically reduce stockouts and strip out all those labor costs associated with having people audit the inventory.
Win-win.
But the sources also introduce consignment inventory here, which takes this whole concept a step further by altering the financial mechanics, right? Not just the logistics.
Yeah, consignment is a really interesting twist.
Let's differentiate the two for everyone listening. VMI focuses on who controls the replenishment data. How does consignment change the equation?
Consignment inventory addresses the balance sheet. So, in a consignment model, the supplier physically places the inventory at the buyer's facility, just like in VMI.
Okay.
However, the supplier actually legally retains ownership of that inventory until the exact moment the buyer consumes it in the manufacturing process or sells it to an end customer.
Wow. That is a massive advantage for the buyer's working capital.
Oh, it frees up millions in cash flow. The buyer essentially has this localized stockpile of raw materials ready for immediate use, but they haven't spent a single dollar to acquire it yet.
That's incredible.
Right. The financial liability only triggers upon actual consumption.
So if I'm understanding this, the buyer shifts both the logistical burden via VMI and the financial burden via consignment completely back to the supplier.
They do.
But, and there's always a but, this introduces the next major vulnerability. By integrating ERPs, turning over the keys to the warehouse, and relying on the supplier to manage stock levels autonomously, the buyer is basically outsourcing a mission-critical part of their operation.
Yeah, you are handing over a lot of trust.
Right. You cannot deploy a system with that level of autonomy without some kind of rigorous control mechanism to monitor it.
Because you lose that daily oversight that a traditional purchasing cycle gives you.
Exactly.
So to regain that control without reintroducing all the friction we just got rid of, organizations rely on formal supplier performance scorecards.
Keeping score. And the sources divide these scorecards into two distinct categories, right? Quantitative and qualitative metrics.
Yep, hard data versus the relationship.
If we use the analogy of evaluating like a complex cloud computing infrastructure, say some enterprise software integration,
Yeah.
you need to monitor both the hard data and the operational relationship.
That's a good way to look at it.
Like on the quantitative side, you measure the undeniably objective metrics, uptime, latency, error rates. For a physical supplier, I imagine that translates to product defect rates, on-time delivery percentages, things like that.
Exactly. The objective reality of their supply chain execution. Cost variances, data accuracy within that EDI system we just discussed, and whether they possess specific industry certifications.
But the qualitative metrics are just as crucial, much like evaluating the strategic value of a software vendor. It isn't just about server uptime. It's about, how does their engineering team respond when a crisis hits?
Right, the human element.
For suppliers, the scorecard measures the buyer's experience of service. It's like evaluating a professional athlete. You need their quantitative stats like sprint speed, but you also desperately need the qualitative stats. Are they a good locker room presence? Do they communicate well with the coach?
I love that analogy because a supplier who hits 99% on-time delivery but, actively hides impending material shortages from the buyer, that is a critical liability.
Yeah, you can't trust them.
The qualitative metrics capture the actual health of the partnership. Furthermore, the text outlines a really vital best practice regarding how these scorecards are even deployed.
Which is?
The most sophisticated procurement teams do not use these metrics as punitive instruments for, end-of-year reviews.
So they aren't treating it like a report card designed to justify firing them or terminating a contract.
No, not at all. They utilize what the texts call short feedback loops.
Short feedback loops.
Right. The scorecard acts as a dynamic dashboard. The buyer consistently shares this performance data with the supplier, sometimes weekly or even monthly, highlighting negative variances way before they compound into systemic failures.
It's an active collaboration.
Exactly. It's a mechanism designed to align the supplier's operational execution directly with the buyer's overarching strategic objectives.
Okay, this brings us to a highly complex expansion of this scorecard concept. Because among the quantitative metrics, the sources explicitly highlight ESG, environmental, social, and governance criteria.
Oh, yeah. This is massive.
Tracking a metric like on-time delivery is a straightforward matter of timestamp analysis within an ERP system. But measuring something as vast as the environment or social good across a decentralized global network, that seems incredibly abstract.
It really is.
How does a procurement team objectively measure these factors on a scorecard?
It is arguably the most complex auditing challenge in modern procurement right now. To standardize this, the industry relies on established global frameworks. And the most prominent one in our sources is the Global Reporting Initiative, or the GRI standards for sustainable supply chains.
The framework for evaluating the triple bottom line.
Correct. So the traditional corporate model focused singularly on profit, right? The GRI framework expands the definition of organizational success to 3 interconnected pillars: people, planet, and profit.
Let's break down the specific parameters within the GRI framework.
Okay.
So the people pillar evaluates the treatment of workers, labor rights, and the general well-being of the communities where the supplier operates.
Right.
And the planet pillar attempts to quantify energy consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, waste management, and pollution outputs.
Exactly. And crucially, the profit pillar is redefined here.
How so?
It does not merely measure the financial margin of the transaction anymore.
Yeah.
It explicitly includes the protection of corporate reputation and the mitigation of legal liabilities stemming from supplier behavior.
See, let's examine the actual mechanism of data collection here,
Yeah,
because I have to play the skeptic for a second.
go for it.
It is one thing to demand that a direct Tier 1 supplier adheres to environmental standards. It is entirely different to accurately track the labor practices or the Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions of a Tier 3 subcontractor.
You mean the little factory producing the raw components halfway across the globe?
Right. How is this data actively gathered and verified? Is this just a paperwork exercise to look good? Relying on an honor system where a supplier simply checks a box on a self-assessment form?
That is the exact trap many companies fall into. Relying on self-reporting is known to lead to greenwashing, where a supplier basically presents an illusion of compliance.
Which is worse than doing nothing at all.
It really is. To combat this, the GRI performance indicators are highly granular and require systemic proof. Buyers employ specialized third-party auditing firms to conduct unannounced site visits.
Oh, unannounced.
Yeah, they utilize digital traceability platforms to literally map the provenance of raw materials from the mine all the way to the assembly line.
Wow.
They even require suppliers to implement formal environmental management systems, like ISO 14001, which mandate continuous documented tracking of things like water discharge volumes and specific particulate emissions.
So the buyer is demanding actual telemetry data on power consumption and waste output, verified by independent inspectors.
Yes, exactly.
That level of supply chain transparency has got to be extraordinarily expensive to build and maintain.
It is not cheap.
Which begs the operational question.
Right.
Why are enterprise procurement teams suddenly allocating massive budgets to enforce these GRI standards? Is it just out of the goodness of their hearts?
No, it leads directly back to that expanded definition of the third pillar, profit.
Oh.
The text frames sustainability not just as an ethical mandate, but as an acute risk management strategy. While deploying third-party auditors and tracking emissions is expensive, the financial exposure of ignoring these standards is catastrophic.
Let's contextualize that risk for a second. Imagine a major consumer electronics brand utilizes a deeply embedded supplier solely because they offer the absolute lowest unit cost.
Right, they just want cheap parts.
And they actively choose to ignore the qualitative data regarding that supplier's waste disposal methods or labor conditions.
Big mistake. Because when an investigative report inevitably uncovers that this supplier is dumping toxic heavy metals into a local water source or, utilizing coercive labor practices,
the global public does not direct its outrage at the anonymous Tier 3 subcontractor.
No, they don't even know who that is.
The outrage and the financial consequences are directed entirely at the electronics brand whose logo is printed on the finished product.
Exactly. The reputational damage triggers an immediate financial shockwave. Consumer boycotts lead to collapsing quarterly revenues. Institutional investors dump the stock because of ESG non-compliance.
And the brand potentially faces severe regulatory fines or even import bans based on new supply chain negligence laws.
The liability is completely transferred up the chain. Therefore, the profit aspect literally demands rigorous enforcement of the people and planet aspects.
It's all connected.
It is. Ignoring global sustainability standards is just terrible supply chain management because it leaves the entire enterprise exposed to an existential threat. Evaluating suppliers against GRI standards is basically the ultimate evolution of the scorecard. It protects the enterprise from risks that exist far beyond the loading dock.
It represents a complete shift from a purely transactional mindset to a really holistic systems engineering mindset.
Beautifully said.
To summarize the whole journey we just analyzed for you listening, an organization cannot scale if it relies on that frictional 5-step purchasing cycle for routine materials.
Right, it's just too slow.
By upgrading to contract buying and blanket POs, they establish automated purchasing pathways. But to prevent those automated pathways from causing inventory chaos, they shifted the logistical and financial burdens back to the vendors through VMI and consignment models.
And because that shift requires deep ERP integration and giving up daily oversight, they have to implement rigorous supplier performance scorecards.
Establishing those short feedback loops to monitor everything from delivery latency all the way down to localized greenhouse gas emissions.
It is an invisible, highly synchronized architecture that governs pretty much every physical object around us.
It really is. Think about the physical device you are utilizing to listen to this deep dive right now.
Yeah, look at your phone or your laptop.
If you were to trace its components backward through the supply network, Consider how many blanket orders were executed.
How many vendor-managed warehouses triggered automated replenishment alerts via EDI?
Exactly. And how many complex GRI performance scorecards its hundreds of individual components had to pass through before it was finally assembled and shipped to your hands.
The depth of coordination required just to put that device in your hand is staggering.
It's mind-blowing. And when you consider the sheer scale of those global GRI metrics, you really have to wonder, what hidden environmental or operational costs might still be slipping past those scorecards today, buried deep in a Tier 3 supply network?
That is the million-dollar question.
Something to ponder. Until next time, keep analyzing the systems around you.